There are moments in history when everything changes, not because of war, not because of an election, not because of one extraordinary person appears at exactly the right moment, but because the rules themselves have changed. The Industrial Revolution was one of those moments. When most of us think about the Industrial Revolution, we picture factories, smokestacks, giant machines, and perhaps inventions whose names we learned in school. We tend to think of it as a story of innovation, a story of progress, and it certainly was, but it was something else as well. It fundamentally changed the way power was organized. It created institutions unlike anything humanity had ever seen before, organizations with resources, influence, and longevity that would eventually rival governments themselves. Today, I want to tell the beginning of that story, because before we can understand modern corporations, before we can understand lobbying, before we can understand public relations, before we can understand why so much economic and political power is concentrated in relatively few hands, we have to understand three industries: transportation, steel, and oil. These three industries didn't simply build modern America. In many ways, they built the modern world.
If you want to understand the way some system works, you look at its institutional structure.
The world before railroads. Before we talk about Rockefeller, before Carnegie, before Standard Oil, before U.S. Steel, let's imagine America around the year 1800. It was an enormous country, but in many ways it didn't function like one. Travel was slow, communication was slower. Moving goods from one place to another was incredibly expensive. If you wanted to ship grain from Ohio to New York, furniture from Pennsylvania to Georgia, or cotton from the South to the factories of New England, the biggest obstacle wasn't producing the goods. It was moving them. Distance was one of the greatest economic barriers in human history. Today, we hardly think about transportation. A package leaves a warehouse in California and 2 days later, it's sitting on your front porch. I use Amazon all the time. We take that for granted. For most of human history, nothing remotely like that existed. Roads were often little more than muddy trails. Heavy wagons frequently became stuck. Travel by horse was exhausting and slow. Rivers were useful, but only if they happened to flow where you needed them. Canals helped in certain regions, but they connected only specific places. Geography dictated commerce. Nature dictated economics. Communities tended to be local because they had little choice. Farmers sold to nearby towns. Craftsmen served nearby customers. Most people lived and died without traveling very far from where they were born. The United States was politically one nation, but economically it was many. The Transportation Revolution. Everything began to change in the 19th century. First canals, then steam engines, then railroads. If the Industrial Revolution had a circulatory system, the railroad became its bloodstream. For the first time in history, distance began losing its power. Products could move hundreds of miles, then thousands. Raw materials could be gathered from one region, manufactured somewhere else, and sold almost anywhere. Entire markets that had once been isolated suddenly became connected. Think about how revolutionary that really was. Before railroads, a factory's customers might live 50 miles away. After railroads, its customers might live 1,500 miles away. The size of the market exploded, and when markets expand, businesses expand with them. This wasn't simply a transportation story. It was an economic revolution, a cultural revolution, and eventually a political revolution. Because whoever controlled transportation controlled commerce. And whoever controlled commerce would soon possess unprecedented wealth. Why transportation changed everything. The railroad did something remarkable. It didn't just move products, it standardized time itself. Before railroads, towns often kept their own local time based on the position of the sun. It wasn't a problem when travel took days or weeks, but railroads couldn't function that way. If every town kept a different clock, schedules became impossible. So railroad companies helped create standardized time zones. Think about that for a moment. Private transportation companies weren't simply moving freight. They were reorganizing how an entire civilization measured time. That's the scale of change we're talking about. The railroad shrank America. It connected farmers with distant cities, factories with national markets, ports with inland communities. Ideas spread faster, people moved farther, capital flowed more freely, opportunity expanded. But so did something else, power. Because every railroad line represented more than steel laid across the landscape. It represented control. Control over movement, control over commerce, control over economic life itself. And almost immediately, a handful of entrepreneurs recognized exactly what that meant. Some would become extraordinarily wealthy. Others would become legends. One of those men was Andrew Carnegie. But Carnegie's empire would never have existed without another revolution happening at exactly the same time. A revolution in steel, and that's where our story goes next. Steel, the metal that built America. If railroads became the circulatory system of the Industrial Revolution, steel became its skeleton. Every mile of railroad track, every bridge, every factory, every skyscraper that would eventually redefine the American skyline depended on one thing: steel. Now, steel itself wasn't new. Human beings had been making steel for centuries. The problem wasn't that we didn't know how to make it. The problem was that it was slow, it was expensive, and it couldn't be produced in the enormous quantities an industrial society suddenly demanded. Then came a breakthrough. In the 1850s, an English inventor named Henry Bessemer developed a new process that dramatically reduced both the time and cost required to manufacture steel. Instead of taking days, it could be done in minutes. That one invention changed the economics of an entire civilization, and suddenly steel wasn't a luxury. It became infrastructure. The timing could not have been better. America was expanding westward. Cities were growing. Railroads were racing across the continent. Demand seemed almost limitless. Whoever could produce steel efficiently would help build the future. And one man understood that opportunity perhaps better than anyone else: Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie's big idea. Carnegie wasn't the greatest inventor of his age. He wasn't even the first steel manufacturer. His genius was organizational. He understood something that would become one of the defining ideas of modern capitalism. Efficiency compounds. Saving 1 penny isn't impressive. Saving 1 penny 1,000,000 times? Well, that changes history. Carnegie obsessed over efficiency. Every process was measured, every expense scrutinized, every improvement adopted if it lowered costs. His managers constantly searched for better methods. New technologies weren't viewed as interesting innovations. They were competitive weapons. If a newer furnace produced steel more cheaply, install it. If another process produced waste, adopt it immediately. If another mill could produce more efficiently, buy it. And if a competitor couldn't keep up, eventually, well, they just disappeared. This relentless pursuit of efficiency allowed Carnegie Steel to produce enormous quantities of steel at prices many competitors simply could not match. From one perspective, this was exactly how competitive markets were supposed to work. Consumers benefited, railroads became cheaper to build, cities expanded faster, industrial growth accelerated, America became wealthier. But there was another side to the story, because efficiency rarely exists in isolation. It creates scale, and scale creates concentration. The birth of industrial empires. As companies became larger, they gained advantages that smaller competitors simply couldn't match. They could negotiate lower prices, borrow money more easily, purchase equipment in greater quantities, hire specialized managers, invest in research, absorb temporary losses. In short, being big increasingly made it easier to become even bigger. Economists sometimes call this increasing returns to scale. But however we describe it, the consequences were enormous. For most of human history, business had been relatively local. A blacksmith, a miller, a merchant, a farmer. Now entire industries were beginning to consolidate under fewer and fewer organizations. This wasn't merely success, it represented a completely new scale of economic organization. Organizations employing tens of thousands of workers, managing operations across multiple states, moving enormous amounts of capital, coordinating production across an entire continent. These weren't simply businesses anymore. They were becoming institutions. Vertical integration. One of Carnegie's most important ideas was something economists called vertical integration. The concept is surprisingly simple. Instead of depending on dozens of separate companies, why not own the entire process? If you need iron ore, own the mines. If you need coal, own the coal fields. If you need ships, own the ships. If you need railroads, invest in the railroads. If you need steel mills, own those too. Rather than paying profits to someone else at every step, you control every stage yourself. Think of it like building a house. Most of us hire one contractor. That contractor hires electricians, plumbers, roofers, and carpenters. I just did this recently with our basement. I know exactly how that goes. And now imagine owning every one of those businesses yourself. Your own lumber company, your own supplier, your own trucking fleet, your own construction crews. You control the entire chain from raw materials to finished product. That's essentially what Carnegie built. It wasn't just a steel company, it was an industrial ecosystem. Every improvement made every other part of the system more efficient. Every dollar saved strengthened the entire enterprise. It was an astonishing achievement in organization, but it also concentrated more economic power into fewer hands than America had ever seen before. And Carnegie was not alone. While he was reshaping steel, another entrepreneur was applying many of these same principles to an entirely different resource. A resource that would soon become more valuable than steel itself: oil. And unlike steel, oil wasn't just going to build the modern economy, it was going to fuel it. That's where our story turns next. Oil, the fuel of the new world. While Andrew Carnegie was reshaping the steel industry, another revolution was quietly unfolding beneath the ground. In 1859, Edwin Drake drilled what is generally considered America's first successful commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. At first, oil wasn't valuable because of gasoline. In fact, gasoline was largely considered a nuisance. The real prize was kerosene. Before electricity, cities and homes depended on lamps for light. Whale oil had become increasingly scarce and expensive, making illumination a luxury for many families. Kerosene changed that almost overnight. It burned cleaner, it burned brighter, and it cost far less. Almost immediately, thousands of entrepreneurs rushed into the oil business. Wells appeared everywhere. Speculation ran wild. Fortunes were made and lost almost overnight. The industry was chaotic. Prices swung wildly. Boomtowns appeared almost as quickly as they disappeared. To many people, it looked like opportunity. To one man, it looked like inefficiency. That man was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller's different question. Rockefeller didn't become wealthy simply because he found oil. He became wealthy because he asked a different question. Most people looked at the oil industry and asked, how can I produce more oil? Rockefeller asked, how can I build a system that wastes less? He believed uncertainty was expensive, competition was expensive, duplicated infrastructure was expensive, price wars were expensive. His goal wasn't simply production, it was control. Not necessarily control in the sinister sense we often imagine today, but control over processes, control over transportation, control over refining, control over quality, control over distribution. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller was obsessed with efficiency. Every barrel, every shipment, every transaction, every cost, everything was measured. Waste became the enemy. Standard Oil became astonishingly good at refining petroleum. It found profitable uses for products other companies simply threw away: lubricants, paraffin wax, petroleum jelly, industrial chemicals. What others viewed as waste, Rockefeller viewed as opportunity. Efficiency became profit. Profit became expansion. Expansion created even greater efficiency. And the cycle repeated itself. Horizontal integration. Carnegie largely grew by controlling every step of production. Rockefeller mastered another strategy: horizontal integration. Instead of owning every stage of production, he increasingly owned the competitors. Imagine 20 grocery stores operating in your town. Now imagine one company purchasing 19 of them. Suddenly, competition looks very different. Standard Oil expanded through mergers, acquisitions, strategic partnerships, and negotiated agreements with competitors. Some owners sold willingly, others resisted. Some competed fiercely, others eventually concluded they simply could not compete with Standard Oil's size and efficiency. By the 1880s, Standard Oil refined nearly 90% of America's oil. Think about that. One company, 90%. No one had ever seen economic concentration on that scale before. It wasn't simply a successful business. It had become something historically unprecedented. The First Gilded Age. This extraordinary period of industrial growth became known as the Gilded Age. The name comes from Mark Twain's novel, The Gilded Age, published in 1873. Notice the word, not golden, but gilded. Gold is solid. Gilding is the thin layer of gold covering something underneath. Twain was making a subtle observation. America appeared dazzling on the surface. Railroads connected the continent. Factories multiplied. Cities expanded. Technology advanced at breathtaking speed. Millions of immigrants arrived searching for opportunity, and for many, opportunity was very real. Living standards improved dramatically over time. Consumer goods became more affordable. Entirely new industries emerged. Innovation flourished. But beneath that remarkable progress were equally remarkable tensions. Industrial accidents were common. Working conditions were often dangerous. Children worked in factories. Labor disputes sometimes turned violent. Economic panics devastated families with little warning. And wealth accumulated at levels previously unimaginable. By the end of the 19th century, the richest industrialists possessed fortunes larger than the budgets of many governments. This wasn't merely an equality. It represented a new relationship between wealth, institutions, and society itself. When wealth becomes influence. Here's where the story becomes especially interesting. Once these fortunes reached an unprecedented scale, their influence naturally expanded beyond business. Industrialists funded universities, libraries, museums, hospitals, scientific research, churches, political campaigns, newspapers, charitable foundations. Some viewed these men as visionary builders, while others saw ruthless monopolists. History still debates those questions today. But regardless of where one comes down on that debate, one fact is difficult to dispute. The scale of influence extended far beyond the products they sold. Steel companies no longer simply produced steel. Oil companies no longer simply refined petroleum. Railroad companies no longer simply transported freight. These organizations increasingly shaped education, finance, politics, public policy, and even how Americans understood progress itself. Something fundamentally new had entered history. Organizations whose power could outlast their founders. Organizations capable of influencing nearly every aspect of American life. The question was no longer whether corporations could become powerful. What happens when they do? More than inventions. It's very tempting to tell this story as one of heroes and villains. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan. Depending on which history book you read, they're either celebrated as visionary entrepreneurs who built modern America or condemned as robber barons who accumulated enormous fortunes while exploiting workers and crushing competitors. The truth, as is often the case in history, is probably more complicated. These men did not invent ambition. They didn't invent competition. They didn't invent the desire to build wealth. Those motivations have existed throughout human history. What changed were the tools available to them. Railroads allowed businesses to operate on a continental scale. Steel allowed cities and industries to grow in ways that had never been possible. Oil supplied an almost limitless source of inexpensive energy. Technology expanded what was possible. And when what is possible expands, Institutions expand with it. The rise of the modern corporation. For thousands of years, most businesses remained tied to the lives of the people who owned them. A craftsman retired, the business disappeared. A merchant died, the enterprise often disappeared with him. The Industrial Revolution changed all of that. Corporations could now outlive their founders, raise enormous amounts of capital, hire professional managers, acquire competitors, own property across multiple states, influence legislation, shape entire industries. The corporation became something quite remarkable, not because it possessed consciousness, but because it possessed continuity. Individuals came and went. The institution remained. One generation of executives retired and another took their place. Shareholders changed, directors changed, employees even changed, but the organization continued pursuing the same objective: growth, expansion, survival. Over time, the institution itself became the enduring actor. In many ways, it began behaving almost like a living organism, not alive in the biological sense, but persistent, adaptive, resilient, always responding to incentives, always seeking opportunities, always finding new ways to survive. A different way of looking at history. One of the themes we've been exploring throughout Ambiology is that history often looks very different depending on where we choose to focus our attention. We're taught to think in terms of elections, political parties, presidents, wars, individual personalities. Those stories certainly matter, but sometimes they cause us to overlook slower, more powerful forces, technological change, economic incentives, institutional evolution. Those forces rarely make headlines. They don't fit neatly into election cycles. They don't divide cleanly into left versus right. Yet they often reshape society more profoundly than any individual leader ever could. That's why understanding this period matters. The First Gilded Age wasn't simply an era of enormous wealth. It was the birth of institutions that would increasingly influence nearly every aspect of American life. Industry, finance, education, medicine, media, politics, and eventually, even the way we think. The thread running through the season. If you've been with us since episode 1, you may notice a pattern beginning to emerge. We started by questioning whether the familiar political map, the left-right spectrum, is really an adequate way of understanding our society. Then we explored the scholarship behind that idea. Next, we looked at Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth and the moral philosophy surrounding industrial capitalism. Today, we examine the technologies that made unprecedented concentrations of wealth and organizational power possible. None of these are separate stories. They're different chapters of the same story, a story about how human beings organize themselves, how institutions emerge, how power accumulates, and how those institutions eventually begin shaping the very societies that created them. By the dawn of the 20th century, America had become an industrial giant. Its railroads connected a continent. Its steel built cities that reached toward the sky. Its oil powered factories, homes, ships, and eventually automobiles. The transformation was extraordinary, but something else had happened along the way. The organizations created to solve practical problems, moving goods, producing steel, refining oil, had grown into institutions with immense influence over American life. And once institutions reached that scale, they began affecting far more than the industries that gave them birth. They shape education, finance, law, public policy, culture, even our understanding of what's possible, which raises a fascinating question. If corporations became some of the most powerful institutions ever created, what exactly are they? Are they simply businesses? Are they simply a collection of contracts? Or have they become something else entirely? Because before we can understand the world we live in today, we first have to understand one of the most remarkable inventions of the modern age, the corporation itself. That's where we're going next time on Ambiology. The Industrial Revolution gave us railroads, steel, oil, and corporations capable of operating on a scale the world has never seen before. But once these organizations became larger than many governments, a new question emerged. Not just how powerful they should become, but what they actually are, legally speaking. What is a corporation? It's easy to think of one as simply a company, a business, a collection of employees. But the law began moving in a very different direction. Over time, corporations were granted many of the same legal rights that had once belonged only to human beings. The ability to own property, to enter contracts, to sue and be sued. Eventually, even claims to constitutional protections. How did that happen? Who decided it? And what were the consequences? Because if institutions can possess rights once reserved for people, then perhaps we need to ask a deeper question. When we say that corporations are people, what kind of people have we created? And what happens when those people never die, never retire, never sleep, and can accumulate wealth and influence for centuries? Next time, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating and misunderstood ideas in modern history. Corporations are people too. This is Ambiology, and if you're willing to question the story, we'll keep following it together. And if this conversation resonated with you, if it made you pause, question something, or see things just a little differently, please take a moment to follow or subscribe to the show. It really helps us grow and continue having these kind of conversations. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who's been thinking about these same questions, share this episode with them. Because ultimately, this isn't just something to listen to, it's something to talk about. You can also find us on social media, where we will be sharing clips, ideas, and continuing the conversation beyond the podcast. So give us a follow, join in, and let us know what you're thinking. We're building this in real time, and we'd love to have you be a part of it. This show is produced by me, Steve Ordower, and Blake Minnerly. The graphic artist and social media manager is Carrie Tanner. This show was edited by Adam Shakur. Thanks for listening. I'm Steve Ordower.
This has been a Rhythm and Light production.